old and new faces. As you know, today's webinar is organized by the Rhetoric and Discourse Society of Ghana. My name is Elias Adanu. I'm an assistant professor of Rhetoric and Writing Studies at the University of Texas at El Paso, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. Our speakers for today's webinar are Drs. Ruby Pappoe and Nancy Henaku. Dr. Ruby Pappoe holds a PhD in Rhetoric and Composition from the University of Texas at El Paso. She's a teaching assistant professor in technical writing at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she teaches technical and professional communication, digital writing, and composition. Her research is situated at the intersections of cultural rhetorics, visual communication, and technology design. She's currently exploring how Africans and African identity are represented in digital and visual spaces. Dr. Nancy Henaku holds a PhD in Rhetoric, Theory, and Culture from Michigan Technological University and is currently a lecturer at the Department of English, University of Ghana. She's an interdisciplinary scholar whose research is situated at the intersection of rhetoric, politics, and culture, broadly defined, with particular interest in the transnational resonance of global Southern discursive practices. And our speakers will speak on the topic African Rhetoric Then and Now. And it's drawn from their wonderful book chapter, African Rhetoric as an Emergent Subfield, a Review of Literature and Reflections on Critical Issues, which was recently published in a companion to African Rhetoric. And if you haven't had the chance to get the book for yourself now, you definitely should. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Drs. Ruby and Nancy Henaku.
Thank you, Elias, for the nice introduction. And welcome again, everyone. Nancy and I are very excited to share our research with you. And I'll hand it over to Nancy.
Okay, thank you, Ruby. So let's go to the next slide, please. Before we start our presentation, we'd like to thank the editors of the companion to African Rhetoric, the reviewers, and then other authors in the companion for their various contributions to our chapter in the book itself. Thank you. Okay. So our presentation is in three parts. We will have the overview, which contextualizes the presentation, and then we'll highlight some of our core findings, and then of course conclude the presentation. So the purpose of our project was to review available literature on African rhetoric as a basis for reflecting on some of the critical issues within the corpus, and then also to begin to understand African rhetoric from, to begin to comprehensively understand African rhetoric, even as we think of ways in which the available research enriches, but also interrogates mainstream rhetorical scholarship. In the chapter, we had three main questions. First, what does a review tell us about the state of the scholarship in African rhetoric? And then second, what are the implications of the current research direction of the subfield, with a focus on the gaps, the challenges, and possibilities? And then finally, we considered the question, what insights can African rhetorical studies contribute to ongoing discussions on extending and diversifying the field of rhetoric? Okay, so as far as context is concerned, we, at least in this presentation, we would like to highlight two contextual factors that informed our analysis. The first one is related to some existing conversation about the marginalization of Africa in the larger field of rhetoric. So for example, in 1971, Smith referred to the paucity of research on African rhetoric. And 38 years after that, in 2009, Blake argued that in terms of rhetorical studies, Africa, in his own words, remains a dark continent. Interestingly, when Blake made that statement in his book, which was published in 2009, the African Association of the African Journal of Rhetoric in 2009 had also published its first issue. But 2 years before that, the African Association of Rhetoric was already organizing its biennial conference on the continent. And since 2007, we know that as at now, 2023, the African Association of Rhetoric is 16 years. And just last year, the companion to African Rhetoric was published. When we decided to write our chapter, we felt that the publication of the companion was very important as far as, you know, a certain invention of African Rhetoric as a subfield was concerned. And so we thought that served as an inspiration to look back at what has been done within the subfield so that we can begin to forge ahead. And so that's one of the contexts that informed our decision to review literature in the subfield. The other contexts, Ruby, the next slide.
Yes, I'm clicking. It's actually exactly
sorry.
I'm clicking and it's still responding. I'm so sorry. Let me hit.
I'll just go ahead.
Yes.
So the other context is related to what we call the global 10 in rhetorical studies. So in recent times, there's been a lot of conversation about diversifying and expanding the field of rhetoric beyond its Western frontiers, and the need for us to highlight alternative global and non-Western traditions. And so, for example, just last year, or was it this year, the Global Rhetorical Traditions was published. And before the publication of the Companion to African Rhetoric, the Routledge Handbook of Comparative World Rhetorics was published. But also before then, other publications such as Rhetoric Before and Beyond the Greeks by Lipson and Co. Were published. And basically, we felt that the discussion around African rhetoric was in many ways connected to some of these ongoing conversations in the field of rhetoric, and to better situate African rhetoric within this larger conversation, we felt it was necessary for us to review what has been done within the field, within our subfield, so we can see how it engages with some of the larger conversations in the mainstream scholarship.
Okay, so as Nancy has gone ahead to explain, our work responds to ongoing conversations to diversify mainstream rhetorical traditions and epistemologies. And in line with this, our work draws on the Akan Edinkra concept of Sankofa as our epistemic orientation. Now, Sankofa means to go back and fetch it. As we can see from the slide, it is visually represented as a bird with a precious egg in its mouth, having the head turned backward, even as its feet face forward, which means that this bird picks for the present the best from the past and then moves ahead. And it is this understanding that inspired our argument that we need to go back and look at what has been done in terms of the state of the subfield to be able to learn and forge ahead. But we also want to note that we are very mindful of the fact that, you know, sometimes Sankofa has been used in a way that limits its understanding. For example, that Sankofa only means, you know, taken from the past. For example, Kepa Mensah has a poem on Sankofa in which, you know, he tried to argue against this understanding. And he says that Sankofa, in fact, defies temporal linearity by emphasizing a past, present, future symbiosis. In short, Sankofa inspires changes that open possibilities for the future while presently looking into the past for what is worth keeping. And there are three ways that we use Sankofa. Because of time, I'll go ahead and just talk about the two. The first reason is that we wanted to use this concept to highlight its emphasis on the interconnection between the past, present, and future. As a discipline, we argue that you know, we need to go back to see what has been done and then think about ways that we need to move forward based on what we see the state of the field looking in terms of current research. Secondly, we also argue that it is not a taboo to go back and research older African practices, and more importantly, to think about what these hold for us in terms of theorizing African philosophies of communication. So in terms of relevant sources, there are 3 core courses that we collected our data from, and these are the journals of major African rhetoric organizations. So we collected sources from the AJR, which is the Journal of the African Association of Rhetoric. We also collected sources from their conference proceedings called Balaga, and we also collected sources from the African Yearbook of Rhetoric, which is the journal for the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. In addition to these 3, we also collected data from major rhetoric communication journals like Rhetorica, Rhetoric Society Quarterly. We also looked at dissertations and monographs. We also, more importantly, got a number of sources from research in related fields like linguistics and orature. And finally, we looked at a few syllabi on African rhetoric, or rhetoric in general as it is being taught in Africa or African universities. And finally, we also found it very important to read programs of major rhetoric organizations to help us understand how or how the mainstream field is actually engaging with non-Western rhetorics, and more specifically African rhetoric. In terms of our analytical focus, as we looked into the sources that we collected, there were 3 main areas that we highlighted. And these would be the context, the methods, and the themes in terms of topics that have been discussed so far in African rhetoric. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Nancy for us to take us through the first section of our findings.
Okay, so Ruby, the next slide, please. So we noticed that one of the major themes in the scholarship was this connection between rhetorics of Africa, or what we are calling rhetorics of Africa, and African rhetorics. So, and that's related to the fact that African rhetoricians have had to grapple with the meanings of and implications of the 2 words that constitute the subfield, Africa and rhetoric. And so African rhetoricians have always had to ask themselves, what is Africa and what is rhetoric? And what does it mean for, to study rhetoric, on the continent? But related to these 2 central questions is also this further distinction and connection between rhetorics of Africa, which we defined as rhetorical inventions of the African continent, and then African rhetorics, which we defined as communicative practices or traditions from the African continent. We noticed that how Africa and its rhetorics were defined impacted what was emphasized, de-emphasized, or even erased in the scholarship. So, for example, Mahaffey argues that Africa is constituted as Africa by the world outside, and that over the years, there have been rhetorical shifts in constructions of Africa, not in darkness and light tropes, to a darkened Africa, and finally to a dark Africa. The dark continent imagery, according to Mahaffey, constrains African rhetorical sovereignty. And so in many ways, Mahaffey's work helps us to understand perhaps one of the reasons why Africa has been marginalized within the field of rhetoric. But also related to the points that Mahaffey is making about this dark Africa trope is a statement by Blake in his publication, The African Origins of Rhetoric, where he says that Africa remains the dark continent in rhetorical studies. So we notice that in his efforts to intervene in the scholarship in rhetoric, Blake also reproduces this problematic trope of Africa as a dark continent, although in this case he was speaking specifically to the place of Africa in the larger field of rhetoric. But also we notice that in some scholarship, or often Africa is associated with oral culture. And that's evident in Kennedy's work, Kennedy's small work on Africa in his book on comparative rhetorics, but also in Smith's publication in the markings of African rhetoric. Ruby, can we go to the next slide, please? So while Smith links traditional African verbal arts and philosophy, his analysis seemingly constructs Africa as unchanging and primarily oral or oral. And so we asked to what extent does Smith's argument hold in contemporary times when Africa is constantly in a flux and many of the sources of traditional African rhetorics are transforming significantly in response to new developments. And for example, if you look at the transformations that the Idinkra symbols are going through in contemporary times, that's an example. But also the existence of the Idinkra symbols, which the Sankofa is part of, suggests that rhetoric in African context moves beyond just the oral, and that we need to begin to look at other aspects of African rhetorical traditions. Maybe next slide, please. So in terms of the sources of African rhetoric, or in terms of the context of African rhetoric, we notice that publications from the continent, we found lots of publications from Nigeria and South Africa in the publications from the continent. And by that, we are referring to the AJR and IEL, the African Yearbook of Rhetoric. And our explanation is that both the African Association of Rhetoric and then the Association of Rhetoric and Communication Studies in Southern Africa are both connected to South Africa and Nigeria. For example, the African Association of Rhetoric has had many of its conferences in South Africa. And, and in fact, the association, the conversations to begin the association began in Nigeria. And rhetoricians such as Segun Ige come from Nigeria. And so we see that there is obviously a Nigerian connection that explains why we have lots of publications from Nigeria and the African publications. But also the Association of Rhetoric and Communication in Southern Africa is located in the Faculty of Law, the Rhetoric program at the Faculty of Law, University of Cape Town. And so that also explains why we have a lot of publications in South Africa. And then we noticed that in more recent times, we found substantial work on Ghana. For example, Buko's work, and then of course, in the recent publication in Communication Review, the special issue on African communication practices, we see work by Eric Johnson and so on and so forth that speaks specifically to the Ghanaian context. But we also noticed that, especially in Ghana, Nkrumah is perhaps the most researched Ghanaian rhetor. And that makes a lot of sense because, you know, Nkrumah was a prolific speaker and writer, and he has been an important figure as far as, you know, global Pan-African rhetoric is concerned. And as far as publications on the continent are concerned, we noticed that there is a certain emphasis, or until recently, there has been an emphasis on Egyptian rhetoric. Yes. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so, no, I think we need to go back. Yes. Methods used, yes. So we also noticed, we found something very interesting as far as both rhetorical education and methods of research are concerned in the literature. We notice, for example, that scholarship from the continent tended to use more traditional classical rhetorical, theories. And there are several reasons for this, but we felt that one of the reasons is possibly the disciplinary orientation of the scholars. So, for example, Segun Ige talks about his classical bias in one of the issues of the AJR. And Victor Alumona, who is a philosopher, also wrote about the rhetoric of Ojukwu's Ahiara Declaration related to the Biafra secession and so on. And he talked about the fact that he researches at the interface between ancient Greek rhetoric and the skeptical turn of the mind. And we also noticed that scholars outside the continent were informed by current discourses on diversification in the field. Even in Smith's earlier work, we noticed that he was still engaged with some earlier conversation about diversifying the field of rhetoric. But some of these more recent works that engage with the diversification are Buko's work on dram rhetorics in African context. Ruby, next slide, please.
Because we're for
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can go to the next slide. So at this point, I'd like to highlight some of the topics or the themes that we found in the scholarship. We noticed that we identified a number of themes. These include rhetoric, politics and public policy, rhetoric and media, rhetoric and health communication, rhetorics of gender and identity, rhetoric and the environment, rhetoric, language and interculturalism, rhetoric and literature. But we noticed that of all these thematic patterns that we found, a majority of the scholarship, especially from the publication on the continent, focused on the intersection between rhetoric, politics, and public policy. And again, there are several explanations for this, one of which is the fact that rhetoric itself as a field is strongly connected to political performances and especially to democracy. And so it made a lot of sense that obviously in the scholarship from the continent, there was this emphasis. But we also noticed that both the AJR and IO were interested in political issues and especially the democratic experimentation in African context. And because of that, even the conference calls of the African Association of Rhetoric tended to emphasize politics. And so that's probably explains why we have many of the publications from the continent highlighting the connection between rhetoric, politics, and public policy. And especially in relation to the AJR, they often take publications, they often take manuscripts from the conference. They often publish manuscripts from the conference. So if the conference calls are highlighting the intersection between rhetoric, politics, and public policy, it also directly feeds into the kind of publications that we have in the journal.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So I'll go ahead and quickly go through some of the critical issues that came up in our review. And for the sake of time, I would just highlight the points, and if we have questions, we can always come back. But the first issue that we noticed has to do with the uncritical use of Western terminologies and methodologies in studying African rhetoric. And for example, we noticed that dated publications such as Finnegan's, I think, Oral Literature in Africa, Okpewu's The Epic in Africa, and Kennedy's Formal Speech in Some Non-Literate Cultures were all dated in terms of the lenses that they were working from. And these lenses were focused on, not really responding to diversification of mainstream rhetoric, which we recognize that these publications were, published at a time when the ongoing calls to diversify mainstream rhetoric had not begun. But the main thing we want to point out is the fact that we need to see more work responding to these calls and researching within a comparative framework. So, for example, recent research like Pappoe's analysis of African drum language, which Nancy touched on, excellently defies classical, understandings of rhetoric. However, one thing we noticed was that when he was explaining the pathetic appeal in the use of the drum language, for example, he deferred back to classical notions of pathos, which we explained that it does not account for the spiritual dimensions of African drum language, which is very, very important. We also noticed that a lot of the research would focus on thematic discussions without really highlighting the rhetorical dimensions of the analysis. So, for example, Dlamini was researching or discussing the Gatherings Act in South Africa and how it infringed on people's rights, as well as how it was used by the police abusively. And while it was a very insightful analysis, he did not really touch on those rhetorical aspects of the communicative, issues going on, for example, in the Gatherings Act itself as a constitution. And the other thing we noticed is, some problematic concepts. And this was very important, especially for theory building. So Philippe Salazar, who is one of the prominent African rhetoricians, was comparing South Africa to ancient Athens. And one of the points that he made is that we can compare South Africa to ancient Athens because of the way that in South Africa, social deliberations is very important to democratic experiments. Now, while his analysis was really focused on theory building and it really contributed significantly to the field, we argued that such comparisons erases differences, for example, in African rhetorical traditions and Western rhetorical traditions. Another issue with that terminology of African Athens is the way that it presupposes the West as first, and then all else like Africa must follow. The third issue that came up had to do with issue in terms of gaps in the literature, and there were a lot of gaps. There were gaps in terms of the time period, and we noticed that there aren't a lot of work in discussing African rhetorical practices in the 20th century and beyond. And this is very important because, as we know, the 20th century is around that era where, discussions about decolonizations, there were organizing and, Africans asserting their autonomy against colonization. And all of these organizings and, decolonial processes where, had a lot of rhetorical dimensions to it. And as scholars, we need to go back and look at some of these rhetorical dimensions within this era. We also notice gaps in terms of archival work. And so archival work is very important because we felt there is the need for us to go back and look at, older African practices that, have been silenced. And so recently, Campbell published a work on African antiquity, and it really contributed significantly to the kinds of things that we can do as far as archival work is concerned. There is also the gaps in terms of subject matter. And here, one important point that we made is that there aren't a lot of work on African women's rhetorical practices. And we also noted that, in mainstream rhetoric, for a long time, there was a challenge with regard to the lack of visibility as far as women's rhetoric are concerned. And as we are shaping the direction of the subfield, we don't want to walk the same path. Last but one, we also talked about gaps in terms of rhetorical modes. Nancy mentioned one point with regard to the popular idea that African rhetoric, focuses just on the oral aspect, or that because the data publications most of the time focus on speech, we don't see publications that look at other aspects of African rhetoric in terms of the different modes in the communicative forms that we see in Africa. And so we need work on digital and multimodal rhetorics, and we also need work that looks at the visual aspect of African rhetoric as well, which is very important. For example, with regard to the Edinkra symbols that we used for our epistemic orientation. And finally, there's also gaps in terms of space. We noticed that we didn't see a lot of work that we're talking about rhetorical practices in North Africa and the south of the Sahara. And we feel that while there may be work in this area, we for some reason we didn't see them in the literature, and that's something that we need to go back and look at. And so I'll go on and talk about one last thing that we discussed in terms of critical issues, and this would be the rhetorical education and pedagogical issues. When it comes to construction of African rhetoric, it is also important that we look at how African rhetoric is being taught, but also, whether or not rhetoric is being taught on the continent. And we noticed that besides the graduate program in rhetoric from the University of South Africa, right? Yeah, I think I'm on that slide. Besides the graduate program from the university in South Africa, as you can see here, there aren't any graduate programs on the continent. And so that's something that we highlighted. However, we did see a few courses still being taught in African rhetoric, or in rhetoric in general on the continent. And I'll talk about that briefly. But like you can see here, the Center for Rhetorical Studies in UCT is housed in the law department, which is very interesting. And I won't have time to talk about that. But the next syllabus that we want to highlight here is the University of Winneba. It's from the University of Education, Winneba. And this course is being taught by Christiana Hammond and is titled Rhetorical Theory and Practice. And that was one of the, syllabi that we found as, offering courses in rhetoric within the continent. And we also noticed that the University of Nigeria has a few courses on Arabic rhetoric, which we also thought was very interesting. And I'll pause here and make one point. So we realized that whenever, Arabic rhetoric is being taught, most of the time, it is not considered as African rhetoric. It is considered as Middle Eastern rhetorics. For example, in my school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, there is a huge program on Arabic communicative practices and also teaching Arabic language, but it is not considered within the purview of African rhetoric. And as we are mapping the state of the field, we need to go back and look at some of these areas and begin to claim these areas as part of African rhetoric. And I'll go ahead and skip through the syllabus here and jump us to the conclusion. Let's see if I think I have a few minutes. But so having said all and having looked at everything that has been done based on our research, there were a few things that came up in terms of, possibilities for future research, possibilities for direction in the field, and possibilities for theory building. The first is the diversification of scholarship in the subfield in terms of methodologies, topics, space, temporality. And we want to know that, what we mean by this is, we need more work that is doing African rhetoric from a comparative lens, where we are looking at African epistemologies and looking at how they enrich mainstream rhetorical practices, not just using the old Greco-Roman rhetorical concepts to analyze African rhetorical practices. And we want to say that, this work is already being done, and we are very excited about it. So for example, within the year that the African the companion to African Rhetoric was published. There were a number of issues that were published, which really highlights some of the points that we have been making so far in terms of, amplifying non-Western perspectives. And I'm going to read a few of these studies here. But for example, the special issue in Review of Communication has a number of titles, and one of the titles is The Grammar and Rhetoric of African Subjectivity, Ethics, Image, and Language. There is another publication in that special issue that is titled Promoting African Knowledge in Communication Studies, African Feminisms as Critical Decolonial Praxis. And both of these chapters were published under the issue titled Retheorizing Communication Studies from African Perspective. So we can see that, some of this work is already being done. And Dr. Koka's presentation in our last webinar, where he was looking at amphi-rhetorics in Ghana, is an example of that. And then finally, also the RDGS, our own organization, we have a forthcoming publication on the elections, on elections, the COVID-19 elections, sorry. And in that publication, we looked at the rhetorical dimensions of the communications that, were used during the COVID-19 elections period. So this work is being done and we are excited about it. We want to highlight that. We recognize that, scholars have already started doing this work. Secondly, we also want to challenge any notion that Africa is the dark continent in the field. And I think this is a very important point because, sometimes as African students, when we are doing research, there's the idea that, I can't find anything on African rhetoric. I know I had that challenge in grad school, but based on our research, you realize that a lot of work has been done. We have our references at the end of the presentation and we can share them. And you can also read a chapter for yourself in the companion. The companion itself, right, offers a lot of, publications that we can use to begin, or we can use as a starting point. And, to challenge this notion that as far as rhetorical practices are concerned, Africa is a dark continent. It is not true. A lot of work has been done. And wrapping up here, we also want to draw attention to alternative sources of publications. You realize that a lot of work that were done before focused on speech and orality, and we need more work that highlights, the different communicative forms within the African context. And then finally, we need to focus on theory building going forward. I want to read a little from what we said in our conclusion from the chapter. So we said that we do not intend to create a dichotomy between theory building and analysis. For theory building can also sustain colonial knowledge making within ironic implications for rhetorical studies of and about Africa. Our understanding of theory building requires African rhetoricians to engage with African communicative epistemologies and their complex relations from epistemologies from elsewhere. Such perspectives will enrich rhetorical scholarship by building understanding of rhetorical traditions based on African cultural forms. Based on African cultural norms, subjectivities, and contexts, while opening space for intercultural dialogue between African, Western, and other non-African contexts, particularly at a time when discussions on the diversification of rhetorical scholarship abound. And thank you for listening to our presentations. I'll hand it over to Elias.
Thank you very much, Ruby and Nancy, for that wonderful presentation. The sheer breadth, scope, and volume and level of detail makes this a good primer for both new and experienced scholars in the field. And I really like your list of gaps, which provides a good starting point for anyone who is currently at a loss on where to make the greatest impacts in African rhetoric. So thanks for that. I also like the distinction you make between the rhetorics of Africa and African rhetorics. And And I'm going to adopt that for my own work. It's very useful language for some of the stuff that I'm currently working on. It's interesting to see the cross purposes between continental African scholars and African scholars writing from outside the continent. And it's always an opportunity to reflect on our own biases and influences and so on. Things are sort of gradually changing, but I know this trend existed in English or exists in English departments generally, right? So it's not just a rhetoric problem. When I was at Legon, many of my courses were in British and Russian literature, much more than in African literature. And it was when I left Ghana that I then had the opportunity to study more of African literature. So it's interesting to see some of those continental differences. Regarding your point about publications and conferences hosted in South Africa, I wondered if it was possible for this group to secure a standing slot in the Ghana Studies Association conferences held in Accra. I know they are usually held in different parts of Ghana. So I wonder if it's possible for this group to secure a standing slot. I think they hold it every other year or so, as a way of sort of building capacity over time to draw other African scholars or African rhetorical scholars to Ghana, and then we can host our own eventually and so on. But yeah, those are just a few thoughts. I have questions of my own, but I think I'll defer to the audience first. So if you have any questions, kindly unmute and ask, or you can just type in the chat and I'll be happy to read it out for you. I've been informed that because the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube, it's best if you turn on your video as you ask your question. And I'll pause here for any questions to flow.
Okay, I would take the lead. So thank you very much, Dr. Pappoe and Dr. Henaku, for this insightful work. My question is about archive. So I want to know what challenges you faced when exploring, especially continental publications on Africa. And if you face any challenge at all, how did you navigate that? Because I feel like it's more difficult to assess scholarship that is published on the continent, because most of it is not digital. And for you, I think at the time you did this work, you were both in the US. So how were you able to assess those kinds of archives? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I'm going to jump in, and Nancy, you can come in. But for example, when we started looking for sources, it was very difficult to, like you said, to access the African publications, especially. They were online, but you had to pay for, and it was very expensive. So what was really helpful was that we reached out to the editors and we asked them to send us the volumes, and they sent us like a whole big box. So that was very, very helpful. And without that, we couldn't have access without having to pay huge sums of money for each and every single article in, you know, the various issues that were published. And I think because of, you know, our connection with Shegun, that's the editor of the AJR, that's why we were able to get those sources. I think that IO is free online, so we were able to access that. And the Balaga also is free, but the AJR, it wasn't free. And as I mentioned, it was because we knew the editor, right? That's how we were able to access that. So I wonder if that answers the question. I'll let Nancy come in. Is Nancy still here? I think she dropped off.
No, I think she's here.
Oh yeah, I see her.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess we'll have the next question then.
Okay.
Well, while we wait for the next question, I have a question for the audience, actually. So in your paper, I saw that you itemized a list that was provided by Ajikum's work on Akan equivalents for persuasive discourse. So he was trying to find words in Akan that approximate very well the term rhetoric. And some of the things listed were dada, defe, koko, I don't know what that is, kasahuam, kasade, kasapa, and so on. And I've just been wondering, I'm Ewe, and I speak Fanti and Tree, and no, I don't speak Ga. But I've also just been trying to come up with a list of words like that that approximate persuasive discourse. So I'm just asking the audience at this point, if you can think of all the Ghanaian languages you speak and whether you can come up with a list of your own and post it in the chat for us to read outside this list provided. That would be wonderful. So you write the language and then any word in that language that means persuasive discourse or something like that. And I think it might be an interesting thing to have a compilation in a variety of languages of all the different terms that can stand in for rhetoric. It's sort of like key terms in Ghanaian rhetorical study or something like that, I guess.
Yeah, I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of one in Ga. I'm a Ga, so.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry, I'm having network challenges, so I keep going off, but I'm here at the moment.
Okay, that's fine.
Maybe I can, Ejaji, would you like to repeat your question? I wonder if Nancy would have more comments on that.
Okay, so Nancy, I was asking about the archive. So how were you able to assess the scholarship that's available on the continent? What are the challenges you faced in collecting the materials you analyzed, and how did you overcome those challenges?
First of all, AJR, we had to, if Ruby remembers,
yes,
luckily for me, yes. So remember, for AJR, the publications are online, but it's difficult to assess the publications. Even for my own publication, at some point I had to do interlibrary loan, and it took a long time to get it via interlibrary loan. But when we were working on this, we had to go to, luckily for me, I had to go for a conference in DC. So I went to Howard, and then I met Shegun. So Shegun gave us copies of
Nancy, I don't think we can hear you anymore.
Yeah, I think her network dropped.
I think her network is gone.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see anyone planning to ask a question yet, so I'll go ahead and ask mine. I have two. The first is whether you found any instances of writing studies research, because I know in North America, writing studies is a component of rhetoric, but in your article, I didn't see any mention of writing studies at all. So I was curious about that, whether people are doing African rhetoric and focusing on writing studies specifically. Then the second question is, I think you made, and let me try and pull the quotes here. There was a quote in your paper, and I'm going to read it out. It says that while we acknowledge the centrality of culture in rhetorical practices, we wonder if these perspectives do not limit how African rhetoric is conceived, and ask whether it is unlikely to examine African rhetoric beyond culture and identity, right? So you're sort of proposing a view of African rhetoric beyond culture and identity. And I'm really interested in this subject because it's an accusation I face very often as someone who does work on Afropolitanism, right? Like very often there's a certain charge of Afropolitanism as being inauthentic, or not representing a certain kind of African identity. And so I'm curious to know what sorts of theoretical models or assumptions you have that go beyond culture and identity. I, for example, am interested in aesthetics, right? Beyond just culture and identity and so on. So I'm just wondering if you have any specific other things in mind when we talk about going beyond these two terms.
Yeah. I think I will need some time to think about the question. And I also want to look at the specific part of the work where we made that comment.
So as you are looking at that, I think I have something that I can tell Dr. Adam. So there was a recent publication by Judith Leketi Makelela from South Africa and Judith White from, I think, University of London. They have a thing called digital African multilingualism, which is a theory they try to develop to explain how African languages negotiate like stylistically, rhetorically in digital spaces like Facebook, Twitter, and the rest. And they use Ubuntu to do that kind of work, that one language cannot exist in that space without depending on the other. So the existence of one necessitates the existence of the other. Therefore, there is this kind of necessary blend that goes on, which is significant for how African languages are performing in social media spaces. But also, when you look at how we use language in everyday Africa, Ghana, for instance, you see that in an hour, you have spoken at least 2 different languages or 3 different languages. So that 2 exist together at the same time. So they have that concept of digital African multilingualism. And then concerning writing studies that uses rhetoric and African rhetoric, I would say one of our members, he's not here, Dr. Linford Lamptey, just defended a dissertation that uses Ga language and Ga symbols. So something like Edinkra, the Ga version of Edinkra, and how it is used to communicate in digital spaces. So I think some of those works are there, but again, we need to find them and then see how we can use them. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mark. I think Mark.
Yes.
Sorry, my internet went off.
Okay.
Okay. So Mark, you can go ahead. We can't hear you. Okay, as Mark gets ready, Marian, can you please ask your question?
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I think mine is more of a commentary, trying to, as it were, put myself, see where sort of my own research fits into this dialogue that you're having about African rhetorics. And looking at generally that oftentimes, being no expert whatsoever on rhetorics, by the way, just so everyone knows, that looking at my field of literary and cultural studies, I see a trend in what you were talking about. And by the way, I also like the Sankofa very much and what it represents. I'm working on history, and I'm working on the history of slavery, for example, and I'm thinking in the way that Ejoji was asking the question about the archive and how it was difficult for you to access the archive. And I wonder if that's not actually one of the first problems that we have, right? That we don't have archives. I was in Ghana in 2018 in the National Archives in Accra and in Cape Coast. I was sad in Accra and mournful in Cape Coast. It was bad. And I'm sorting through papers which are falling apart in my hands. And I'm wondering that if I leave this building and I don't document what I just read, someone else will not find the same thing that I found, right? It's that bad. And I think that goes a long way and contributes to this misconception that we've gone from, you know, this colonial imperial discourse of being the dark continent to actually being in the dark simply because we are missing our archives, right? And so one of the philosophies that I work with is basically rewritings and unburials, right? Because we say we want to write kind of a new history of, you know, African rhetoric, keeping in mind all the ones that came before and the gaps, right, missing and leaving Africa out as if nothing was said before. And the problem is if you are not documenting what already exists, if you have difficulty accessing, then it's like we will always feel as if we are just starting out, even though the source materials have always been there. And for example, someone was asking me, they wanted to do a Ghanaian evening reading somewhere in the US, and they wanted me to kind of suggest folktales, right, from Ghana. And I was like, where do I even start? I know them, right? The problem with the Rachel, I know them, at least Akan ones. I can, you know, tell them, but what if in retelling, they mess it up or they leave some things out or they change it or whatever. And so all I'm saying basically is perhaps we should also focus a lot on the way that we can retrieve the archives to begin with, to see what is there, make sure that we preserve it. So maybe those coming after us are not going to have so much difficulty in accessing what we struggle to access, basically. And I think we can build on from there. Yeah, and I'm thinking about that in connection to basically these communication practices of Africa that you're talking about, also coming from dating, cry and other things. But I think those would be some things for a different a talk for a different time. But for now, I'm kind of really drawn to this burials and preserving of the archives, basically. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Elias, I would jump your authority and say Dr. McNulty could go ahead and ask the question and we'll take it from there. Okay, my authority.
Right, thanks, Edgarji. I hope you can hear me now. You can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, right. So thanks very much, Nancy and Ruby, for the insightful talk. I joined a bit late, so sorry if my question perhaps have been addressed. So a couple of things I just want to find out. First, if you did notice any paradigm shifts between then and now in the studies that you reviewed. And then secondly, I mean, from your own review of the literature and then your own, observation, what do you think the future of, African rhetoric looks like?
That's a very good question. Yes. So in the conclusion, when I was talking about the kinds of things that we need to do as we move ahead, I talked about, the fact that the kinds of work that we are calling on us as scholars to do in terms of amplifying non-Western traditions and researching African rhetoric within the context of Africa is already happening, where we are seeing, scholars do African rhetoric from that comparative lens. And one example would be, Campbell's work, where she did the archival work on African antiquity, and she was using a framework within the African context. So, and the communication review, the review of communication special issue that I also just highlighted, we haven't read those sources. I haven't read those sources, so I don't know the kinds of framework that they are using, but just looking at their titles, it sort of, shows the kinds of possibilities that we are calling for. And so this is what we noticed, that the current publications are answering the call in terms of, doing recontextualization, looking at African rhetoric within that context and looking at, different ways in which we can find our own concepts to research African rhetorical practices. Even the work that we did with our own research, looking at the Sankofa and, using that way of knowing to research African rhetoric, right? The current state is an example. So that's it. So in terms of paradigm shift, yes, that is what we see. And I'll answer your question about, what do we think is a feature of the field?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think that one thing that kept on coming back, Nancy, is the idea of, theory building, because, so we say that, yes, we need to research African rhetorical practices within our own context, but what are these concepts that we can use? We haven't done a lot of, theories, from African perspectives that, scholars can use. And so theory building is very, very important, yeah, and that's one thing that we talked about. Nancy.
All right, sure, thanks.
You're welcome.
Hello, Ruby, and thank you. I want to respond to Marian's question, and then I'll also add on to the points that Ruby raised in response to Mark's question. So I think Marian, but that's also in many ways related to Ejoji's earlier question about how we collected the African publications. So first of all, I'll say that we used what we were able to find, which actually presupposed even the references we have is incomplete. So if we say that, and that is why our argument that Africa is not a dark continent in rhetorical studies holds true, because this is just what we were able to find. So imagine if we were able to get all of the sources that, all of the sources or all of the publications on Africa, which is impossible. There are some dissertations. There was a dissertation on Kwame Nkrumah at the University of at the BAM library that we couldn't have access. We didn't talk about it in our way, and so on. But most important, I also want to say that in relation to the question of archives, I understand that there are indeed challenges with the archives, and but we also need to rethink what an archive is, because the idea of the archive may not necessarily, certain understandings of the archive may not necessarily apply in our specific context. And also we need to think beyond institutional archives. We need to think about alternative archives. We need to rethink our notion of the archive. I remember some time ago when Ejoji's grandfather died, he posted on Facebook that, he's a whole archive, right? And so if we start thinking of archives, we need to, if we start rethinking our notions of archive, then we'll begin to see things that would answer some of the questions that we have for our research. But having said that, I recognize that there are major archival issues, and Ruby and I talked about that in the chapter. But to add to what Ruby's response to Mark's question, I think that Ruby was unable to highlight some important aspects of the rhetorical education at the very final part of our presentation because of time. But I see that there's a strong connection between rhetorical scholarship and rhetorical education, in the sense that if we have more students, more people graduating with degrees in rhetoric, it will automatically feed into the future of rhetorical scholarship. And currently, we have so many people, or we have a number of people graduating with degrees in rhetoric. I spoke to Professor Pappoe, who is the current rector of GIJ, now part of UNIMAC in Ghana. And he mentioned that when he returned to University of Cape Coast, or at the University of Cape Coast, he was the only rhetorician. And then when he joined, he introduced, I know, at least 2 courses in rhetoric, which Dr. Kuka is now teaching. And so that tells us, I think that's trajectory tells us about the connection between rhetorical education and the future of African rhetorical scholarship. And I think that we have a bright future, because we have so many people graduating with degrees in rhetoric. And Ghana alone, I can count how many people have graduated with degrees in rhetoric in recent times. And I think that we have an exciting future ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We have Stephen Janto's hand up. We are currently at the 1 hour mark, so I think your question would be last. But before, I wanted to note that when I asked earlier for people to post in the group chat about alternatives to, or Ghanaian language alternatives to the word rhetoric, Ejoji posted at the VV, which is where it means tasty tongue, and then which means good speaking. And I still encourage others to post. I'm very curious about what terms there are in Ga as well. Nancy Frimpong posted in the chats. For me, cultural models used singularly can be problematic since it can be dismissive. By dismissive, I mean it can make visible the coexistence between varied interaction and linkages that African ways of being, aesthetics, and performance have with the rest of the world. Thank you for that comment, Nancy. And we'll have this final question by Dr. Stephen Jantwa, and then I think that will be it for today. Unless there are any other pressing questions, we might make a little room for that. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, I want to begin by thanking Doctors Nancy and Ruby for the insightful presentation. I just want to chime in on the issue of archives, and it is really a big elephant in the room when it comes to research or studies on rhetoric in Africa. And I had a first-hand experience with that when I did my master's on presidential rhetoric. And I think I was probably one of the first few people to make such inroads in that of the Ghanaian presidential rhetoric. And it was interesting to know that we have no record of just speeches delivered by Ghana's presidents since just 1991, 1992, that are like this Fourth Republic. And my study actually, I wanted to chronicle all the speeches delivered by the various presidents since independence, and I couldn't find the record. So I had to go back to the drawing board and change the focus of my research and say, okay, well, let me now focus on just the Fourth Republic. And it's interesting to know that even Fourth Republic, it was very hard to come by primary records, primary transcript of speeches. And it was really painstaking. And so we need to really dedicate a lot of our attention to that. And it's not easy. We need to build the corpus. We need to create the archives. And it should be something that we have to do consciously. We can't always depend on fleeting form of archive like oral accounts, which will die with the people who have the knowledge. And so we need to consciously start recording, interviewing people, and it's a lot of work. So until we're able to find or create a corpus, create archives and all of that, it's going to be a very big challenge for us as rhetoricians. And I believe we should channel our attention to those things because it's a big challenge. And I try to do that myself. So as soon as I finished my dissertation, I think about 3 years ago, I decided to create a website. And in fact, I abandoned that project because I was doing it alone. I wanted to publish all the presidential speeches, just one genre so far. That's the inaugural addresses. And I'm thinking about my thinking is I want to include the other genres of presidential speech so that we have like a one-stop shop for all presidential speeches, so that in future, if somebody wants to carry out a research on Ghana's presidents, they can just go to that place and just source the speeches from there. But there's more, and we need to really consciously work on those things. Otherwise, we'll always keep on complaining, and it will be hard for us to really create a full picture of really what this rhetoric entails. And archiving really is a very significant, a very important aspect of our research. So that's what I want to say. And I believe we can sort of deliberate on some of these things and look at how we can go about this. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Dr. Ruby Pappoe and Dr. Nancy Henaku.
Thank you.